He came back screaming from the sky. "Welcome back to the vault. I am the warden. Tonight I have unlocked something that has been sealed away since 1910. A story that existed before the language for it did. The Wendigo, by Algernon Blackwood. You will understand, when it is finished, why men who have spent time in the deep wilderness sometimes refuse to go back. There is a particular kind of horror that has no body to put a bullet in, no face to look away from. It is the horror of scale, of realizing, in a wilderness so vast it has no edges, that something older than civilization finds you interesting. Blackwood spent years in the Canadian backcountry. He did not invent the Wendigo. He survived it long enough to write it down. He wrote this in 1910, at the height of the Edwardian era, when the educated world was absolutely certain that science and reason had accounted for everything. Published in a collection called The Lost Valley, Howard Phillips Lovecraft read it and named Blackwood the finest horror writer alive. That matters, because what you are about to hear is not the shadow of cosmic horror. It is the thing itself, before anyone had named it. The setting: a hunting camp north of Rat Portage, Ontario. The last week of October. 4 men at the edge of the wilderness, one of whom is afraid of a name he refuses to say aloud. Outside the tent, 1,000,000 trees, and beyond the trees, something that moves faster than anything living should be able to move. The door is open. Come down. Begin. A considerable number of hunting parties were out that year without finding so much as a fresh trail, for the moose were uncommonly shy, and the various Nimrods returned to their families with the best excuses the facts of their imaginations could suggest. Dr. Cathcart, among others, came back without a trophy, but he brought instead the memory of an experience which he declares was worth all the bull moose that had ever been shot. But then Cathcart of Aberdeen was interested in other things besides moose, amongst them the vagaries of the human mind. Besides himself and his guide, Hank Davis, there was young Simpson, his nephew, a divinity student, then on his first visit to Canadian backwoods, and the latter's guide, Defago. Joseph Defago was a French-Canadian who had strayed from his native Quebec years before, a man of unparalleled knowledge of woodcraft and bush lore, who could also sing the old voyageur songs and tell a capital hunting yarn into the bargain. He was deeply susceptible to that singular spell which the wilderness lays upon certain lonely natures, and he loved the wild solitudes with a kind of romantic passion that amounted almost to an obsession. The party round the blazing fire that night were despondent. A week had passed without a single sign of moose. The silence of the vast listening forest stole forward and enveloped them. Overhead the stars were brilliant in a sky quite wintry, and there was so little wind that ice was already forming stealthily along the shores of the still lake behind them. Hank broke in with his nasal voice. "I'm in favor of breaking new ground tomorrow, Doc." The plan emerged. Cathcart and Hank west toward Garden Lake, Simpson and Defago east across the lake, over the portage, and down the southern shore of 50 Island Water. It was obvious to anyone that Defago did not jump at the plan, but his silence conveyed something more than ordinary disapproval, and across his sensitive dark face there passed a curious expression like a flash of firelight. Cathcart noticed the look. Simpson, too sleepy to catch it, moved off to bed. Hank, rather than becoming explosive at Defago's reluctance, began at once to humor him, speaking in a perceptibly hushed tone, carefully. "But there ain't no special reason why no one's been up there this year. Not the reason you mean, anyway." The words were meant to be encouraging. They were not. Defago raised his eyes, then dropped them again. A breath of wind stirred the embers into a brief blaze. Cathcart noticed the expression in the guide's face a second time, and this time its nature betrayed itself. In those eyes, for an instant, he caught the gleam of a man scared in his very soul. "Bad Indians up that way?" he asked, with a careful laugh. "Or Anything wrong with the country? Hank met his eye with something less than his usual frankness. He's just scared, he replied good-humoredly, scared stiff about some old fairy tale. Defago looked up. Scared nothing. There's nothing in the bush that can scare Joseph Defago, and don't you forget it. And the natural energy with which he spoke made it impossible to know whether he told the whole truth or only a part of it. And then a sound close behind them in the darkness made all three start. It was old Punk, the Indian cook, who had moved up from his lean-to while they talked and now stood just beyond the circle of firelight, listening. No further conversation was possible. The doctor followed his nephew to the tent. Deep silence fell about the little camp, planted there so audaciously in the jaws of the wilderness. The lake gleamed like a sheet of black glass beneath the stars. An hour later, when all slept like the dead, old Punk crept from his blankets and went down to the shore of the lake like a shadow. He raised his head and looked about him. He listened, then sniffed the air. Motionless as a hemlock stem, he stood there. After 5 minutes again, he lifted his head and sniffed, and yet once again. Then, merging his figure into the surrounding blackness in a way that only wild men and animals understand, he turned and went stealthily back to his lean-to. And soon after he slept, the change of wind he had divined stirred the reflection of the stars within the lake. With it, down the desert paths of night, there passed a curious thin odor, strangely disquieting, an odor of something utterly unknown. The French-Canadian and the man of Indian blood each stirred uneasily in his sleep just about this time, though neither of them woke. Then the ghost of that unforgettably strange odor passed away and was lost among the leagues of tenantless forest beyond. In the morning, the camp was astir before the sun. There had been a light fall of snow during the night, and the air was sharp. All were in good spirits. By 8 o'clock, old Punk had the camp to himself. Cathcart and Hank were far along the trail westwards, while the canoe that carried Defago and Simpson, with silk tent and grub for 2 days, was already a dark speck bobbing on the bosom of the lake, going due east. The wintry sharpness of the air was tempered by a sun that blazed with luxurious warmth upon the world of lake and forest below. And as far as eye could reach rose the leagues of endless crowding bush, desolate in its lonely sweep and grandeur, untrodden by foot of man, stretching its mighty and unbroken carpet right up to the frozen shores of Hudson Bay. Simpson, who saw it all for the first time as he paddled in the bow, was enchanted by its austere beauty, and quietly, somewhere beneath the enchantment, he began to understand his own utter insignificance. They portaged over into 50 Island water and made camp on its shore towards 5 o'clock. The silk tent stood taut and cozy. The fire burned with a minimum of smoke. In front, through doorways pillared by huge straight stems, lay the stretch of 50 Island water, a crescent-shaped lake some 15 miles from tip to tip. A sky of rose and saffron dropped its pale streaming fires across the waves, where the islands floated like the fairy barks of some enchanted fleet. The beauty of the scene was strangely uplifting. Yet ever at the back of Simpson's thoughts lay that other aspect of the wilderness, the merciless spirit of desolation which took no note of man. The sense of his utter loneliness, now that even Defago had briefly gone to scout for moose, came close as he listened for the sound of returning footsteps. There was pleasure in the sensation, yet with it a perfectly comprehensible alarm, and instinctively the thought stirred in him. What should he do if anything happened and Defago did not come back? They enjoyed their well-earned supper, eating untold quantities of fish and drinking unmilked teas strong enough to kill men who had not covered 30 miles of hard going. They smoked and told stories round the blazing fire. Defago was in excellent spirits, though disappointed at having no moose to report. And when Defago's face was lit by the fire, Simpson realized with renewed vividness their position, alone together in the wilderness. "Defago," Simpson said presently, These woods are a bit too big to feel quite comfortable in, eh? He was hardly prepared for the solemnity with which the guide took him up. You've hit it right, Simpson boss, Defago replied, fixing his searching brown eyes on his face. And that's the truth, sure. There's no end to 'em, no end at all. Then, lowering his voice as though to himself, there's lots found out that, and gone plumb to pieces. He led the conversation on to other topics. But the casual mention of 60 miles between them and the home camp again made Simpson realize the prodigious scale of this land. Stories of lost hunters rose persistently before his memory, and he wondered vaguely whether it was the mood of his companion that invited the unwelcome suggestion with such persistence. Sing us a song, Defago, he asked. One of those old voyageur songs, and the Canadian, nothing loth, sent his light voice across the lake in one of those plaintive, almost melancholy chanties. It was in the middle of the third verse that Simpson noticed something unusual. A curious change had come into the man's voice, and looking up quickly, he saw that Defago, though still singing, was peering about him into the bush, as though he heard or saw something. His voice grew fainter, dropped to a hush, then ceased altogether. With a movement amazingly alert, he started to his feet and stood upright, sniffing the air. Like a dog scenting game, he drew the air into his nostrils in short, sharp breaths, turning quickly in all directions, and finally pointing down the lake shore eastwards. Simpson's heart fluttered disagreeably. Lord, man, how you made me jump! He exclaimed, peering over his shoulder into the sea of darkness. What's up? Are you frightened? Even before the question was out of his mouth, he knew it was foolish, for any man with a pair of eyes could see that the Canadian had turned white down to his very gills. Defago turned abruptly. I never said I heard or smelt nothin', he said slowly and emphatically, in an oddly altered voice that conveyed somehow a touch of defiance. Without another word, they sat down again by the fire, Defago changing his side so that he could face the direction the wind came from. Guess now I don't feel like singing any, he explained presently. That song kinder brings back memories that's troublesome to me. He was still fighting with some profoundly moving emotion, but the shadow of an unknown horror had now communicated itself to his companion. After a long spell of smoking and talking, the shadow began imperceptibly to shift. Whatever it was that had passed through their camp, or past it, seemed to have continued on its way. Simpson began to feel that perhaps he had exaggerated. He lit a last pipe and tried to laugh to himself. On getting home to Scotland, it would make quite a good story. He did not realize that this laughter was one of the conventional signs by which a man seriously alarmed tries to persuade himself that he is not so. If this transmission has your attention, the like button, use it. It helps more than you might expect. Defago, however, heard the low and looked up with surprise. What's tickling you? The two men stood side by side, kicking the embers before going to bed. I was thinking of our little toy woods at home, stammered Simpson. A pause followed. All the same, I wouldn't laugh about it if I was you, Defago added, looking over Simpson's shoulder into the shadows. There's places in there nobody won't never see into. Nobody knows what lives in there either. He lingered by the fire, doing a dozen things that did not really need doing. Evidently there was something he wanted to say, yet found it difficult to get at. Say you, Boss Simpson, he began suddenly, as the last shower of sparks went up into the air. You don't smell nothing, do you? Nothing particular, I mean. The commonplace question veiled a dreadfully serious thought. A shiver ran down Simpson's back. Nothing but burning wood, he replied firmly. And all the evening you ain't smelt nothing, persisted Defago, peering through the gloom. Nothing extraordinary and different to anything else you ever smelt before? No, man, nothing at all. Defago's face cleared. That's good, he exclaimed with evident relief. That's good to hear. Then Simpson, regretting the impulse even as he spoke, Have you The Canadian came closer in the darkness. He shook his head. "I guess not," he said, without overwhelming conviction. "It must have been just that song of mine that did it. It's the song they sing in lumber camps and God-forsaken places when they're skeered the Wendigos somewhere around, doing a bit of swift traveling." "And what's the Wendigo, pray?" Simpson asked quickly, irritated because again he could not prevent that sudden shiver of the nerves. Defigo turned swiftly and looked at him as though he were suddenly about to shriek. His eyes shone, his mouth wide open. Yet all he said, whispered rather, for his voice sank very low, was, "It's nothing but what those lousy fellers believe when they've been hitting the bottle too long. A sort of great animal that lives up yonder." He jerked his head northwards, quick as lightning in its tracks, and bigger than anything else in the bush, and ain't supposed to be very good to look at, that's all. They took to their beds. The world of crowding trees pressed close about the small tent, marshalling their million shadows. Between the two lonely figures within, however, there pressed another shadow. Not a shadow from the night. It was the shadow cast by the strange fear that had leaped suddenly upon Defago in the middle of his singing. And Simpson, watching the darkness through the open tent flap, knew first that unique and profound stillness of a primeval forest when no wind stirs, and when the night has weight and substance that enters into the soul to bind a veil about it. Then sleep took him. Yet it was true that the lap of the water just beyond the tent door still beat time with his lessening pulses when he realized he was lying with his eyes open, and that another sound had introduced itself with cunning softness between the splash and murmur of the little waves. Long before he understood what this sound was, it had stirred in him the centers of pity and alarm. He listened intently. Did it come from the lake or from the woods? Then, suddenly, with a rush and a flutter of the heart, he knew that it was close beside him in the tent. It was a sound of weeping. Defago, upon his bed of branches, was sobbing in the darkness, as though his heart would break, the blankets evidently stuffed against his mouth to stifle it. His first feeling, before he could think or reflect, was the rush of a poignant and searching tenderness. This intimate human sound, heard amid the desolation about them, woke pity. It was so incongruous, so pitifully incongruous, and so vain. Tears in this vast and cruel wilderness. Of what avail? He thought of a little child in mid-Atlantic. Then, of course, with fuller realization and the memory of what had gone before, came the descent of the terror upon him, and his blood ran cold. He stretched his hand out and touched him. The body did not stir. He spread an extra fold of his own blankets over the feet that projected beyond the tent mouth. He whispered, "Let me know if anything's wrong, or if I can do anything. Wake me at once if you feel queer." He lay down again, thinking and wondering. Defago had been in his sleep. Some dream had afflicted him, yet never in his life would he forget that pitiful sound of, and the feeling that the whole awful wilderness of woods listened. Sleep, in the long run, proves greater than all emotions. Half an hour later he was oblivious of everything, yet sleep, in this case, was his great enemy, concealing all approaches, smothering the warning of his nerves, and thus the events that now followed, though they actually happened, persuaded the mind somehow that the detail which could explain them had been overlooked in the confusion, and that therefore they were but partly true, the rest delusion. So far as he can recall, it was a violent movement running downwards through the tent toward the door that first woke him, and made him aware that his companion was sitting bolt upright beside him, quivering. Hours must have passed, for it was the pale gleam of dawn that revealed his outline against the canvas. This time the man was not crying. He was quaking like a leaf. The trembling felt plainly through the blankets down the entire length of his own body. Defago had huddled down against him for protection, shrinking away from something that apparently concealed itself near the door flaps of the little tent. And next, almost simultaneous with his waking, The profound stillness of the dawn outside was shattered by a most uncommon sound. It came without warning or audible approach. It was a voice, possibly a human voice, hoarse yet plaintive, a soft roaring voice close outside the tent, overhead rather than upon the ground, of immense volume, and in some strange way most penetratingly and seductively sweet. It rang out in 3 separate and distinct notes, or cries, that bore in some odd fashion a resemblance, far-fetched yet recognizable, to the name of the guide. De-fa-go, a sort of windy, crying voice, as of something lonely and untamed, wild and of abominable power. And even before it ceased, dropping back into the great gulfs of silence, the guide beside him had sprung to his feet with an answering though unintelligible cry. He blundered against the tent pole with violence, shaking the whole structure, spreading his arms out frantically for more room, kicking his legs impetuously free of the clinging blankets. For a second, perhaps 2, he stood upright by the door, his outline dark against the pallor of the dawn. Then, with a furious rushing speed, before his companion could move a hand to stop him, he shot with a plunge through the flaps of canvas, and was gone. And as he went, so astonishingly fast that the voice could actually be heard dying in the distance, he called aloud in tones of anguished terror that at the same time held something strangely like the frenzied exultation of delight. "Oh, oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire! Oh, oh, this height and fiery speed!" And then the distance quickly buried it, and the deep silence of very early morning descended upon the forest as before. It had all come about with such rapidity that, but for the evidence of the empty bed beside him, Simpson could almost have believed it the memory of a nightmare carried over from sleep. He still felt the warm pressure of that vanished body against his side. There lay the twisted blankets in a heap. The very tent yet trembled with the vehemence of the impetuous departure. The strange words rang in his ears, as though he still heard them in the distance, wild language of a suddenly stricken mind. Moreover, it was not only sight and hearing that reported uncommon things to his brain, for even while the man cried and ran, he had become aware that a strange perfume, faint yet pungent, pervaded the interior of the tent, an odor unlike any smell he knew. Acrid, rather, not unlike the odor of a lion, yet softer and not wholly unpleasing, with something almost sweet in it that reminded him of the scent of decaying garden leaves, earth, and the myriad nameless perfumes that make up the odor of a big forest. Then it was wholly gone. He found himself standing by the ashes of the fire in a state of amazement and stupid terror that left him the helpless prey of anything that chose to happen. Had a muskrat poked its muzzle over a rock, he would most likely have fainted, for he felt about the whole affair the touch somewhere of a great outer horror, and his scattered powers had not as yet had time to collect themselves into a definite attitude of fighting self-control. He made coffee. Hot bacon and coffee put a little sense into him, and he realized he had been behaving like a boy. He decided he must make as thorough a search as possible, and failing that, find his way back to the home camp and bring help. Taking food, matches, rifle, and a small axe to blaze the trees against his return, he set forth at 8 o'clock, the sun shining over the tops of the trees in a sky without clouds. Before he had gone a quarter of a mile, he came across the tracks of a large animal in the snow, and beside them the light and smaller tracks of what were beyond question human feet, the feet of Defago. The relief he at once experienced was natural, though brief, for at first sight he saw in these tracks a simple explanation of the whole matter. A bull moose had blundered upon the camp and uttered its cry of alarm. Defago, in whom the hunting instinct was developed to the point of uncanny perfection, had scented the brute and gone after it. Then the impossible explanation faded, as common sense showed him mercilessly that none of this was true. Besides, now that he examined them closer, these were not the tracks of a bull moose at all. They were big, round, ample, and with no pointed outline as of sharp hoofs. He could think of no animal they resembled, and when he coupled them in his imagination with that haunting sound that broke the stillness of the dawn, a momentary dizziness shook his mind. He stooped down to examine the marks more closely, and caught a faint whiff of that sweet yet pungent odor that made him instantly straighten up again, fighting a sensation almost of nausea. Then his memory played him another evil trick. He suddenly recalled those uncovered feet projecting beyond the edge of the tent, the body's appearance of having been dragged toward the opening, the man's shrinking from something by the door when he woke later. The details now beat against his trembling mind with concerted attack. They seemed to gather in those deep spaces of the silent forest about him, where the host of trees stood waiting, listening, watching to see what he would do. The woods were closing round him. They were off by 7, leaving Punk in charge with instructions to have food and fire always ready. In the course of the following day, Simpson found it possible to tell his uncle a good deal more of the story, without divining that it was drawn out of him, in fact, by a very subtle form of cross-examination. He mentioned how Defago spoke vaguely of something he called a Wendigo, how he cried in his sleep, how he imagined an unusual scent about the camp, how he had admitted the bewildering effect of that extraordinary odor, pungent and acrid like the odor of lions. He mentioned these things. He did not mention the singular phrases Defago had used while he was being carried away screaming through the sky, with the net result that Dr. Cathcart, adroit psychologist that he fancied himself to be, had assured him exactly where his mind, influenced by loneliness, bewilderment, and terror, had yielded to the strain and invited delusion. The spell of these terrible solitudes, he said, cannot leave any mind untouched, any mind possessed of the higher imaginative qualities. It has worked upon yours exactly as it worked upon my own when I was your age. The animal that haunted your little camp was undoubtedly a moose, for the bellowing of a moose may sometimes have a very peculiar quality of sound. The colored appearance of the big tracks was obviously a defect of vision in Simpson's own eyes, produced by excitement. The size and stretch of the tracks they would prove when they came to them. The hallucination of an audible voice, the burning feet of fire, was one of the commonest forms of delusion due to mental excitement, an excitement perfectly excusable and wonderfully controlled. The only thing I find it uncommonly difficult to explain, Cathcart added, in a tone that tried to remain casual and did not quite succeed, is that damned odor. And so at last they came to the little camp and found the tent still standing, the remains of the fire, the note pinned to the stake, untouched. The cache had been discovered and opened by muskrats. The matches lay scattered. The food was gone to the last crumb. "Well, fellers, he ain't here," exclaimed Hank loudly. The gloom of Defago's probable fate oppressed the whole party with dreadful gravity the moment they saw the familiar signs of recent occupancy, especially the tent, with the bed of balsam branches still smoothed and flattened by the pressure of his body, brought his presence near to them. After something like 3 hours' search, the darkness already down, the 2 men returned to camp with nothing to report. Fresh snow had covered all signs. There were no fresh tracks of any kind. The snow lay undisturbed. They gathered round the fire for supper, a gloomy and despondent party. Now that the whole truth in all its ugliness was out, it seemed useless to deal in further disguise or pretense. They talked openly of the facts and probabilities. Something on this trip, one might never know precisely what, had sufficed to push Defago over the line. That was all. On the suggestion of Hank, they proposed to wait a little longer and devote the whole of the following day to the most systematic search they could devise. Meanwhile, they talked about the particular form in which the singular panic of the wilderness had made its attack upon the mind of the guide. Hank, though familiar with the legend in its general outline, obviously did not welcome the turn the conversation had taken. He contributed little, though that little was illuminating. He admitted that a story ran over all this section of country to the effect that several Indians had seen the Wendigo along the shores of 50 Island water in the fall of last year, and that this was the true reason of Defago's disinclination to hunt there. A wall of silence wrapped them in, for the snow was sufficient to deaden any noise, and the frost held things pretty tight besides. No sound but their voices and the soft roar of the flames made itself heard. Only, from time to time, something soft as the flutter of a pine moth's wings went past them through the air. No one seemed anxious to go to bed. The hours slipped towards midnight. "The legend is picturesque enough," observed the doctor, speaking to break the silence rather than because he had anything to say. For the Wendigo is simply the call of the wild personified, which some natures hear to their own destruction. "That's about it," Hank said presently, "and there's no misunderstanding when you hear it. It calls you by name right enough." Dr. Cathcart came back to the forbidden subject with a rush that made the others jump. "The allegory is significant," he remarked, looking about him into the darkness, "for the voice, they say, resembles all the minor sounds of the bush, wind, falling water, cries of the animals, and so forth. And once the victim hears that, he's off for good. His most vulnerable points, moreover, are said to be the feet and the eyes, the feet for the lust of wandering, and the eyes for the lust of beauty. The poor beggar goes at such a dreadful speed that he bleeds beneath the eyes, and his feet burn." His voice sank to a hushed tone. "The Wendigo," he added, "is said to burn his feet, owing to the friction apparently caused by its tremendous velocity, till they drop off, and new ones form exactly like its own. You don't always keep to the ground neither," came in Hank's slow, heavy drawl, "for it goes so high that he thinks the stars have set him all afire, and it'll take great thumping jumps sometimes, and run along the tops of the trees, carrying its partner with it, and then dropping him just as a fishhawk will drop a pickerel to kill it before eating. And its food, of all the muck in the whole bush, is moss." And he laughed, a short, unnatural laugh. "It's a moss-eater, is the Wendigo," he added. But Simpson now understood the true purpose of all this talk. What these two men, each strong and experienced in his own way, dreaded more than anything else was silence. They were talking against time. They were talking against darkness, against the invasion of panic, against the admission that reflection might bring, that they were in an enemy's country, and against anything rather than allow their inmost thoughts to assume control. He himself, already initiated by the awful vigil, was beyond both of them in this respect. He had reached the stage where he was immune, but these two, the scoffing analytical doctor and the honest, dogged backwoodsman, each sat trembling in the depths of his being. It was Hank, after a pause longer than the preceding ones that no one seemed able to break, who first let loose all the pent-up emotion, springing suddenly to his feet and letting out the most ear-shattering yell imaginable into the night. He could not contain himself any longer. To make it carry even beyond an ordinary cry, he interrupted its rhythm by shaking the palm of his hand before his mouth. "That's for Defago," he said, looking down at the other two with a queer, defiant laugh. "For it's my belief that my old partner's not far from us at this very minute." In the instant of profound silence that followed Hank's roaring voice, and as though in answer to it, something went past through the darkness of the sky overhead at terrific speed. Something of necessity very large, for it displaced much air. And down between the trees there fell a faint and windy cry of a human voice, calling in tones of indescribable anguish and appeal. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire!" White to the very edge of his shirt, Hank looked stupidly about him like a child. Dr. Cathcart uttered some unintelligible cry, turning with an instinctive movement of blind terror towards the tent, then halting in the act as though frozen. Simpson alone retained his presence of mind. His own horror was too deep to allow of any immediate reaction. He had heard that cry before. Lifting his face to the sky, he cried aloud, "Defago! Defago! Come down here to us! Come down!" And before there was time for anyone to take definite action, there came the sound of something dropping heavily between the trees, striking the branches on the way down, and landing with a dreadful thud upon the frozen earth below. The crash and thunder of it was really terrific. "That's him, so help me the good God," came from Hank in a whispering cry, half choked, his hand going automatically toward the hunting knife in his belt. "And he's coming! He's coming!" As the sounds of heavy footsteps crunching over the snow became distinctly audible, approaching through the blackness towards the circle of light, and while the steps, with their stumbling motion, moved nearer and nearer upon them, the three men stood round that fire, motionless and dumb. Dr. Cathcart had the appearance of a man suddenly withered. Even his eyes did not move. Hank, suffering shockingly, seemed on the verge of violent action, yet did nothing. He too was hewn of stone. Like stricken children they seemed. And meanwhile, their owners still invisible, the footsteps came closer, crunching the frozen snow. It was endless, too prolonged to be quite real, this measured and pitiless approach. Then at length the darkness, having thus laboriously conceived, brought forth a figure. It drew forward into the zone of uncertain light where fire and shadows mingled, not 10 feet away. Then halted, staring at them fixedly. The same instant it started forward again with the spasmodic motion as of a thing moved by wires, and coming up closer to them, full into the glare of the fire. They perceived then that it was a man, and apparently that this man was Defago. If this transmission has your attention, the like button, use it. It helps more than you might expect. Something like a skin of horror almost perceptibly drew down in that moment over every face, and 3 pairs of eyes shone through it, as though they saw across the frontiers of normal vision into the unknown. Defago advanced, his tread faltering and uncertain. He made his way straight up to them as a group first, then turned sharply and peered close into the face of Simpson. The sound of a voice issued from his lips. "Here I am, Boss Simpson. I heard someone calling me." It was a faint, dried-up voice, made wheezy and breathless as by immense exertion. "I'm having a regular hellfire kind of a trip, I am." And he laughed, thrusting his head forward into the other's face. For the Defago, who sat huddled by the big fire, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot whiskey and holding food in wasted hands, was no more like the guide they had last seen alive than the picture of a man of 60 is like a daguerreotype of his early youth. Nothing really can describe that ghastly caricature, that parody masquerading there in the firelight as Defago. The face was more animal than human, the features drawn about into wrong proportions, the skin loose and hanging, as though he had been subjected to extraordinary pressures and tensions, suggesting a face and body that had been in air so rarefied that, the weight of atmosphere being removed, the entire structure threatened to fly asunder and become incoherent. It was no less a person than Simpson himself, who gave instinctive utterance to the sentence that brought a measure of relief into the ghastly situation by expressing the doubt and thought in each one's heart. "It is you, isn't it, Defago?" he asked under his breath, horror breaking his speech. At once Cathcart burst out with the loud answer, "Of course it is, of course it is. Only, can't you see, he's nearly dead with exhaustion, cold and terror. Isn't that enough to change a man beyond all recognition?" It was said in order to convince himself as much as to convince the others. The overemphasis alone proved that, and continually, while he spoke and acted, he held a handkerchief to his nose. That odor pervaded the whole camp. It was Hank who brought things to a head. He went off to a little distance from the fire, shading his eyes for a moment with both hands, and shouted in a loud voice that held anger and affection dreadfully mingled, "You ain't Defago. You ain't Defago at all. I don't give a damn, but that ain't you, my old pal of 20 years. He glared upon the huddled figure as though he would destroy him with his eyes. He repeated himself in 50 different ways, each more outlandish than the last. The woods rang with echoes. It was impossible to silence him. Horrible to see, horrible to hear, because it was the truth. But in the end, he did nothing, and the whole tempest completed itself very shortly with tears. Hank's voice suddenly broke. He collapsed on the ground, and Cathcart somehow persuaded him at last to go into the tent and lie quiet. The remainder of the affair was witnessed by him from behind the canvas, his white and terrified face peeping through the crack of the tent door flap. Dr. Cathcart, closely followed by his nephew, went up with a determined air and stood opposite the figure of Defago, huddled over the fire. "Defago, tell us what's happened, just a little, so that we can know how best to help you." At first his voice was firm, then it changed in quality, for the figure turned up to him a face so piteous, so terrible, and so little like humanity that the doctor shrank back as from something spiritually unclean. "Out with it, man, out with it," he cried. "None of us can stand this much longer." And then Defago, smiling whitely, answered in that thin and fading voice that already seemed passing over into a sound of quite another character. "I seen that great Wendigo thing," he whispered, sniffing the air about him exactly like an animal. "I been with it too." Whether the poor devil would have said more cannot be known, for at that moment the voice of Hank was heard yelling from behind the canvas at the top of his voice. Such a howling was never heard. His feet, oh God, his feet! Look at his great changed feet! Defago, shuffling where he sat, had moved in such a way that for the first time his legs were in full light and his feet were visible. Yet Simpson had no time himself to see properly what Hank had seen, and Hank has never seen fit to tell. That same instant, with a leap like that of a frightened tiger, Cathcart was upon him, bundling the folds of blanket about his legs with such speed that the young student caught little more than a passing glimpse of something dark and oddly massed where moccasined feet ought to have been, and saw even that with uncertain vision. Then, before the doctor had time to do more, Defago was standing upright in front of them, balancing with pain and difficulty, and upon his shapeless and twisted visage an expression so dark and so malicious that it was, in the true sense, monstrous. "Now you seen it too," he wheezed. "You seen my fiery, burning feet, and now, that is, unless you can save me and prevent, it's about time for—" His piteous voice was interrupted by a sound like the roar of wind coming across the lake. The trees overhead shook their tangled branches. The blazing fire bent its flames as before a blast, and something swept with a terrific rushing noise about the little camp, surrounding it entirely in a single moment of time. Defago shook the clinging blankets from his body, turned toward the woods behind, and with the same stumbling motion that had brought him, was gone. Gone before anyone could move muscle to prevent him. Gone with an amazing, blundering swiftness that left no time to act. The darkness positively swallowed him, and less than a dozen seconds later, above the roar of the swaying trees and the shout of the sudden wind, all three men heard a cry that seemed to drop down upon them from a great height of sky and distance. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire!" Then died away into untold space and silence. Dr. Cathcart, suddenly master of himself, and therefore of the others, was just able to seize Hank violently by the arm as he tried to dash headlong into the bush. "But I want to know, you!" shrieked the guide. "I want to see. That ain't him at all, but some devil that's shunted into his place." Somehow or other, he managed to keep him in the tent and pacify him. It was his nephew, however, hitherto so wonderfully controlled, who gave him most cause for anxiety, for the cumulative strain had now produced a condition of hysteria that made it necessary to isolate him upon a bed of boughs as far removed from Hank as was possible under the circumstances. And there he lay, as the watches of that haunted night passed over the lonely camp, crying startled sentences and fragments of sentences into the folds of his blanket. A quantity of gibberish about speed and height and fire mingled oddly with biblical memories of the classroom. People with broken faces all on fire are coming at a most awful pace towards the camp, he would moan one minute, and the next would sit up and stare into the woods and whisper, "How terrible in the wilderness are the feet of them that," until his uncle came across to change the direction of his thoughts and comfort him. Slow, heavy with dread, let it breathe till the first signs of daylight came. Soon after 5 o'clock, Dr. Cathcart kept his vigil. His face was the color of chalk, and there were strange flushes beneath the eyes. An appalling terror of the soul battled with his will all through those silent hours. These were some of the outer signs. At dawn, he lit the fire himself, made breakfast, and woke the others, and by 7 they were well on their way back to the home camp. 3 perplexed and afflicted men, but each in his own way having reduced his inner turmoil to a condition of more or less systematized order again. They talked little, and then only of the most wholesome and common things, for their minds were charged with painful thoughts that clamored for explanation, though no one dared refer to them. Hank, being nearest to primitive conditions, was the first to find himself. Dr. Cathcart took longer. Simpson, the student of divinity, arranged his conclusions probably with the best, though not most scientific, appearance of order. Out there, in the heart of unreclaimed wilderness, they had surely witnessed something crudely and essentially primitive, something that had survived somehow the advance of humanity and emerged terrifically, betraying a scale of life still monstrous and immature. Simpson envisaged it as a glimpse into prehistoric ages, when superstitions gigantic and uncouth still oppressed the hearts of men, when the forces of nature were still untamed, and the powers that may have haunted a primeval universe had not yet withdrawn. To this day he thinks of what he termed years later in a sermon, savage and formidable potencies lurking behind the souls of men, not evil perhaps in themselves, yet instinctively hostile to humanity as it exists. With his uncle he never discussed the matter in detail, for the barrier between the two types of mind made it difficult. Only once, years later, something led them to the frontier of the subject, of a single detail rather. "Can't you even tell me what they were like?" he asked, and the reply, though conceived in wisdom, was not encouraging. "It is far better you should not try to know or to find out." "Well, that odor?" persisted the nephew. "What do you make of that?" Dr. Cathcart looked at him and raised his eyebrows. "Odors," he replied, "are not so easy as sounds and sights of telepathic communication. I make as much, or as little, probably, as you do yourself." He was not quite so glib as usual with his explanations. That was all. At the fall of day, cold, exhausted, famished, the party came to the end of the long portage and dragged themselves into a camp that at first glimpse seemed empty. Fire there was none, and no punk came forward to welcome them. But the cry of spontaneous affection that burst from the lips of Hank as he rushed ahead toward the fireplace came probably as a warning that the end of the amazing affair was not quite yet, and both Cathcart and his nephew confessed afterwards that when they saw him kneel down in his excitement and embrace something that reclined, gently moving, beside the extinguished ashes, they felt in their very bones that this something would prove to be Defago. The true Defago returned. And so, indeed, it was. Exhausted to the point of emaciation, the French-Canadian, what was left of him that is, fumbled among the ashes, trying to make a fire. His body crouched there, the weak fingers obeying feebly the instinctive habit of a lifetime with twigs and matches. But there was no longer any mind to direct the simple operation. the mind had fled beyond recall, and with it, too, had fled memory. Not only recent events, but all previous life was a blank. This time it was the real man, though incredibly and horribly shrunken. On his face was no expression of any kind whatever. Fear, welcome, or recognition. He did not seem to know who it was that embraced him, or who it was that fed and warmed and spoke to him the words of comfort and relief. Forlorn and broken beyond all reach of human aid, the little man did meekly as he was bidden. The something that had constituted him individual had vanished forever. In some ways it was more terribly moving than anything they had yet seen. That idiot's smile as he drew wads of coarse moss from his swollen cheeks and told them that he was a damned moss-eater. The continued vomiting of even the simplest food, and worst of all, the piteous and childish voice of complaint in which he told them that his feet pained him, burn like fire, which was natural enough when Dr. Cathcart examined them and found that both were dreadfully frozen. Beneath the eyes there were faint indications of recent bleeding, the details of how he survived the prolonged exposure, of where he had been, or of how he covered the great distance from one camp to the other. All this remains unknown. His memory had vanished completely, and before the end of the winter whose beginning witnessed this strange occurrence, Defago, bereft of mind, memory, and soul, had gone with it. He lingered only a few weeks, and what Punk was able to contribute to the story throws no further light upon it. He was cleaning fish by the lake shore about 5 o'clock in the evening, an hour before the search party returned, when he saw this shadow of the guide picking its way weakly into camp. In advance of him, he declares, came the faint whiff of a certain singular odor. That same instant old Punk started for home. He covered the entire journey of 3 days as only Indian blood could have covered it. The terror of a whole race drove him. He knew what it all meant. Defago had seen the Wendigo. The door is closed, for now. What the wilderness takes, it does not always give back. What it does give back is not always what it took. The Wendigo is a story about the limits of rationalism and what lies beyond them. Dr. Cathcart delivered his explanations against a landscape that had already disproved them, and the landscape was not interested in his corrections. What came back through the darkness wearing Defago's face was never fully seen. Hank saw what was beneath the blanket. Blackwood never described it. That is precisely the right decision. The horror that cannot be described is the horror that stays. Defago lingered only a few weeks. The wilderness did not. If this transmission found its mark, leave your mark in return. The like, use it, and I